7. Freud and religion. And biological it had to be for Freud, who sought to dissolve religion by science. Freud's own evaluation of his position is a significant one. Quote, "I regard myself as one of the most dangerous enemies of religion." End quote. Of God, Freud said, quote, "I stand in no awe whatever of the Almighty. If we were ever to meet, I should have more reproaches to make of him than he could make of me. I would ask him why he hadn't endowed me with a better intellectual equipment. He couldn't complain that I have failed to make the best of my so-called freedom." End quote. As a Jew, he felt a dislike for Christianity and referred in a letter to non-Jews as, quote, "the infidels," end quote. Christianity was to him a, quote, "myth," end quote. He explained it away with his anthropological myth of parricide by the primal horde. His animosity was frequently in evidence, but we miss the issue completely if we fail to see that Freud, as a Jew, was more in rebellion against Moses than against Jesus Christ. His hatred of even the forms of Judaism, and he was aware of its departures from the biblical standard, was intense because of its association with Moses and the God of Moses. His son Martin has pointed out that, despite his Jewish social orientation, Sigmund Freud, quote, "never permitted himself to be affected by religious considerations," end quote. Jones stated it more plainly. Freud, quote, "despised," end quote, his parents' Orthodox Judaism. So strongly did he feel about it that, before his wedding, he seriously considered turning to a nominal Protestantism in order, quote, "to be able to marry without the complicated Jewish ceremonies he hated so much," end quote. On occasion, he could express himself with cynicism or contempt towards Jews. Thus, on hearing of Alfred Adler's death, he told Arnold Zweig that he could not understand his sympathy for the death of a Jew boy who had been richly rewarded for his service in having contradicted psychoanalysis. Freud denied knowing Hebrew and Yiddish, although the evidence indicates he knew both. On the whole, however, Freud, while contemptuous of the Mosaic authority, was a dedicated Jew. His letter, a year before his death, to the Committee of the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, best expressed his feelings. Quote, "I gladly and proudly acknowledge my Jewishness through my attitude toward any religion, including ours, is critically negative," end quote. A moderately interested Zionist, Freud was a dedicated member of the B'nai B'rith Lodge, to whom he wrote his earnest appreciation on May 6, 1926, quote, "You were my first audience," end quote. He shared with them, quote, "an inner identity, the familiarity of the same psychological structure," end quote. He recognized, quote, "that it was only to my Jewish nature that I owed the two qualities that have become indispensable to me throughout my difficult life," end quote. First, a prejudice-free intellect, and second, preparation, quote, "to be in the opposition and to renounce agreement with the compact majority," end quote. Freud's background had deep roots in Jewish heretical thought, religious and philosophical thought in rebellion against the merest shadow of Mosaic law. The mystic Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791, for example, had expounded the doctrine of the holiness of sin. Quote, "Through sin, salvation would come. From the great sinning would emerge a world in which there would no longer be sin," end quote. The concept was close to the whole Illuminist tradition of the day, reflected also in the thought of Heinrich von Kleist. In the Jewish tradition, the purpose of these heresies was to break the yoke of the Torah, the yoke of Moses, and to proclaim the law dead. The Kabbalistic tradition, according to Bachan, is deeply embedded in psychoanalysis, and the Zohar hinted symbolically, quote, "at the psychoanalytic notion that the depths of sexual satisfaction are in having intercourse with the mother," end quote. Freud concealed the heretical Jewish nature of his theories, lest it lead to increased hostility to the Jew as a concomitant of the hostility which psychoanalysis would assuredly arouse. But Freud, Bachan holds, himself a Jew, was clearly in the line of the Sabbatai, the false messiah of the Jews of the 17th century who, quote, secularized Jewish mysticism and psychoanalysis can intelligently be viewed as such a secularization, end quote. Freud had, quote, Sabbatian tendencies, end quote. All this was true, and Freud was strongly desirous of an antinomian victory, but he himself was to pronounce judgment on those tendencies. But the matter can be pushed further than the mystical tradition. Behind both Jewish and Christian heresies, there has often been a strong antinomianism rooted in ancient European, Asiatic, and New Eastern fertility cults, many of which long survived in Europe, including Russia. These are all comparable to what the Old Testament called Baal worship, wherein this faith was pushed to its logical conclusions. It is not surprising that, in both church and synagogue, heretical thinkers have been harking back to the values of Baal worship. This has been done more openly in Jewish circles, as witness Theodore H. Gaster's vindication of Baal worship. Dr. Richard L. Rubenstein, director of the Hillel Foundation and chaplain to Jewish students at the University of Pittsburgh, hailed, before a Protestant audience, quote, our rediscovery of Israel's earth and the lost divinities of that earth. Once again, we have come into contact with those powers of life and death which engendered men's feelings about Baal, Astarte, and Anath. These powers have again become decisive in our religious life. End quote. Freud was very deeply a part of this tradition. He sought to cover traces of its immediate Jewish source by welcoming, quote, Christian, end quote, followers. It was important to Freud, as he bluntly told his Jewish followers, that Jung become permanent president of the Psychoanalytic Congress, 1910, in order to remove the Jewish label from Freudian theory. Jones later served a similar purpose, no doubt. Freud saw himself both as the enemy of Moses and also another Moses, pointing the way to a new promised land, seen only from afar. As, quote, the new lawgiver, end quote, he, quote, must be destructive of Moses. The new lawgiver must revoke the older law, end quote. Freud, as he viewed Michelangelo's Moses, saw himself as one of the mob who had turned to the fertility cult worship of the golden calf and as the object of Moses' law and wrath. Freud wrote, Moses and monotheism to accomplish two things. First, he thrust Moses out of Jewry to make him a Gentile, an Egyptian, and thus not one of the chosen people, and second, to, quote, murder, end quote, Moses and his law. Significantly, Freud identified himself a, quote, passionate identification, end quote, Jones tells us, with Hannibal, whom Freud saw as representing the old Jewish Canaanite opposition to Rome, the Catholic Church. Freud took this ancient rootage seriously. Quote, in his rooms, Freud surrounded himself with every heathen god he could find, end quote. The devil in Jewish legend tempted Jews to apostasy, in a sense, to the golden calf. Freud saw himself as Satan in a sense, as a deliverer, and remarked, quote, do you know that I am the devil? All my life I have had to play the devil in order that others would be able to build the most beautiful cathedral with the materials I produced, end quote. His role was messianic. Quote, thereby, under the ruse of playing the devil, he served Sabbatian interests. He narrowed the gap between Jewish culture and Western Enlightenment. In this respect, however, just as Freud may be regarded as having infused Kabbalah into science, so he may be regarded as having incorporated science into Kabbalah. Sabbatian-wise, by closing the gap between Jewish culture and Western Enlightenment, he acts as a messiah not only for Jewish culture, but for the Western culture as well, end quote. His mission was to destroy Moses, who represented the law and the guilt of the law. By making Moses an Egyptian and then killing him, quote, Freud becomes a Jewish hero in the history of the Jews. He performs the traditional messianic function of relieving guilt, the very same function he ascribes to Jesus, end quote. In Moses and Monotheism, Freud's premise, without any evidence, is that Moses was an Egyptian. This is all important for Freud. It is impossible for both Moses and Freud to claim the right to express authentically the elect racial calling and the word of deliverance. And for Freud, the bondage of the law is more fearful than bondage to Pharaoh, so that Moses is a false deliverer. This Egyptian origin of Moses was, quote, based only on psychological probabilities and lacked objective proof, end quote. The, quote, psychological probabilities, end quote, we might add, were entirely in Freud's mind and premised on his own sense of his destiny as against Moses. Moses, the Egyptian, transmitted his own Egyptian faith, quote, that of Inknaton, the Aton religion, end quote, to the Jews. Jews rose up in rebellion against this enslaving tyrant, Moses, and murdered him. But they then faced the wrath of Moses and his law in their own nature, through the return of the repressed. For even as with the primal horde, the law of the father remained. Moses, as a father, gained his vengeance through their id and superego, in whom survives, quote, the archetype of God, the primeval father and his reincarnations, end quote. Freud thus felt that his research freed man in that it, quote, reduces religion to the status of a neurosis of mankind, end quote. Man's freedom required the abolition of religion, quote. In Soviet Russia, the attempt has been made to better the life of 100 million people till now held in suppression. The authorities were bold enough to deprive them of the anodyne of religion and wise enough to grant them a reasonable measure of sexual freedom, end quote. It is thus quite clear that Freud hoped that by the abolition of religion, man's freedom would be affected. Brill goes so far as to speak of, quote, Freud's dictum that no neurosis is possible in a normal sexual life, end quote. Freud gave grounds for such a conclusion, but even more grounds against it. Freud's three favourite among his books were The Interpretation of Dreams, The Three Essays, and Totem and Taboo. But he made clear that, apart from these, quote, perhaps the one for which he had the greatest personal affection was his book on Leonardo, end quote. There is more than a little evidence for this comment. It is important to note that Freud's Leonardo da Vinci, 1910, was his one experiment in quote-unquote biography. Freud, quote, had the utmost respect, end quote, for Leonardo's greatness and identified himself with Leonardo as a lone searcher for natural knowledge. Indeed, Jones goes so far as to say, quote, I am led to this conclusion by the feeling that much of what Freud said when he penetrated into Leonardo's personality was at the same time a self-description. There was surely an extensive identification between Leonardo and himself. There we learned that Leonardo was torn by two impulses, the passion for scientific knowledge and the passion for creating works of art, end quote. It is not our concern here to evaluate Freud's analysis, nor his absurd blunder at a critical point. What is of interest is Freud's identification with a man accused, but acquitted of homosexuality, of whom Freud said, quote, it is doubtful whether Leonardo ever embraced a woman in love, nor is it known that he ever entertained an intimate spiritual relationship with a woman, end quote. Moreover, Leonardo's desire for exhaustive knowledge led him to leave his works usually unfinished. Freud, by contrast, was a family man and a bold and ready theorizer. Quote, Leonardo's dictum, end quote, as Freud saw it, was this, quote, instead of acting and producing, one just investigates, end quote. Here we begin to recognize the identification. Freud could be a Moses only to a point. He knew that there was in all likelihood no promised land. It could be envisioned from afar, but not entered into. Investigation, understanding, then becomes the only proper work of the enlightened one. The hope concerning Russia, which he had expressed in his last book, Moses and Monotheism, he had denied too many times before. Years before, in his Clark University lectures in the United States, he had denied the possibility of escape through sexuality. If guilt were the product of the super-ego alone, then the free-thinking education of the child would remove guilt and repression. But the id itself is a will to death, as well as a will to pleasure, so that the id carries not only guilt within its being, but a sentence of death on that guilt. In the inner conflict of man, therefore, quote, This conflict is not resolved by helping one side to win victory over the other, end quote. Neither asceticism nor the advice to live freely, end quote, will avail. Neither solution will end the inner conflict. Quote, one side in either event will remain unsatisfied, end quote, for man is a walking law or Torah of ancient taboos which govern him infallibly. But Freud does not want to defend, quote, conventional morality. This is at least as far removed from our purpose as the other, end quote. Freud is not a reformer, but an observer. Conventional sexual morality, he affirms and strongly condemns, quote, what the world calls its code of morals demands more sacrifices than it is worth, end quote. Neither sexual license nor unconditional asceticism, although he stated that its neurotic implications could be and often were overestimated, nor any middle course were of any avail. If any, quote, therapeutic effect of psychoanalysis, end quote, were in evidence, it was, quote, the substitution of something conscious for something unconscious, the transformation of the unconscious thoughts into conscious thoughts that makes our work effective, end quote. In other words, understanding is the key, so that whether we follow the way of asceticism, license, or conventional morality, our, quote, liberty, end quote, is not in a change of ways, but in an understanding of why we behave as we do. Freud stated this most clearly in a letter of April 9, 1935, to a woman whose son was a homosexual. He rebuked her for her horror and shame. Quote, homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of, no vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function produced by a certain arrest of sexual development, end quote. Many, quote, highly respectable individuals, end quote, have been homosexuals, such as Plato, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and others. Quote, it is a great injustice to persecute homosexuality as a crime, and a cruelty too. If you do not believe me, read the books of Havelock Ellis, end quote. As for curing her son, that is, to, quote, abolish homosexuality and make normal heterosexuality take its place, end quote, Freud said, quote, in a general way, we cannot promise to achieve it. What analysis can do for your son runs in a different line. If he is unhappy, neurotic, torn by conflicts, inhibited in his social life, analysis may bring him harmony, peace of mind, full efficiency, whether he remains homosexual or gets changed, end quote. Freud has thus accomplished his purpose to a degree. God has been replaced by the biological myth, evolution, and the fall of man by the anthropological myth, parricide, by the primal horde. The law has been abolished and Moses exercised. Guilt remains now, not as a violation of the law of God, but as an offence against the inner law of man's unconscious. The penalty is real, however mythical the original offence. But in the face of this, enlightenment, while not freeing a man from the penalty of guilt, at least enables him to recognize it as mythical so that he can live with it and, in a sense, deny it. Freud's enlightenment is thus comparable in a sense to Christian Science faith. Sickness is unreal because all is mind, the body, matter, non-existent. Hence, there is no death, but if in the meantime we break a leg or begin to die, we have the consolation of knowing that all is father, mother, mind, and hence nothing we experience is real. Frank Podmore's From Mesmer to Christian Science, A Short History of Mental Healing, could be properly extended to include psychoanalysis and Freud. Podmore, 1955 to 1910, was one of the founders of the Fabian Society. The interconnections of occultism, mental healing, socialism, and relativism run deep. Let us return to Freud's letter to the homosexual's mother. It is apparent here that he does not flinch from his conclusion that, because there is no law, there is no sin, no crime. As a result, the most that one can call a criminal offence is, quote, mental sickness, a concept clearly stemming from Freud. If we think in terms of sin, we imply responsibility and hence restitution and punishment. If we think in terms of mental illness, we deny responsibility and make it a medical or psychiatric matter. As a poster widely circulated in the 1950s stated, "Mental sickness is no disgrace. It might happen to anyone." In other words, there is no responsibility. This means that man, not being responsible, has no true liberty, and hence is not entitled to civil liberties either. He can be hospitalized indefinitely for crime and experimented on by psychiatrists. He has no rights.